She collapsed in the snow, clutching her unborn child, while the man who had promised her everything walked away without a glance. The townsfolk turned their backs, leaving her to freeze beneath a howling sky. She should have died there, alone, forgotten. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. Mary Whitaker pressed her gloved hands to her rounded belly as the snowflakes danced around her. She had traveled across the rough American plains, answering the letters of a man who had promised her marriage, safety, and a home for her unborn child. Cast out by her strict family for carrying a child out of wedlock, she clung to this hope like a lifeline. She believed that in this harsh, sprawling land, she could start anew, where past mistakes wouldn't brand her forever. The heavy gray sky bowed low over the fields, swallowing what little warmth remained in the world. The town of Red Creek, barely more than a huddle of clapboard buildings and smoke-threaded chimneys, appeared on the horizon like a frayed edge stitched into the fabric of endless snow. Mary gripped the worn handle of her trunk tighter, feeling the bite of cold through her gloves. Each step she took sent small puffs of white into the air, the snow reaching halfway up her skirts, tugging at her with a stubbornness that mirrored the doubts gnawing at the edges of her heart. She refused to let them in. Not now. Not after everything she had sacrificed. Every letter she had received from Samuel Carter had been folded and refolded until the creases split the paper. Promises of a warm hearth, of steady hands and a voice that would soothe the ache inside her. Promises she had pressed to her chest in the dark, when her father's words still rang in her ears. "You are a disgrace to this family." And the door had shut behind her for the last time. Her boots, mended so many times the soles barely held, slid on patches of hidden ice as she made her way past the livery, the boarded-up mercantile, the frozen pump at the center of the square. Nobody paid her much mind. A heavy-set woman in a too-thin coat, hair hidden beneath a modest bonnet, carrying the evidence of her sins beneath her heart. But Mary held her chin high. The child inside her shifted. A flutter, a gentle reminder that she was not alone, that somewhere ahead, someone waited for her. Someone who had written, "I don't care about your past. We all deserve a second chance." She repeated those words silently with each step. A prayer, a shield, a thread to pull her through the gathering storm. Snow clung to the hem of her dress, heavy and cold, but she pressed on, feeling the outline of Samuel's last letter in her pocket. She imagined a door swinging open, a hand reaching for hers, a place by a fire where her shame would melt away with the frost. She saw it so clearly in her mind it hurt. A room filled not with grandeur, but with welcome, with family, with belonging. The sharp, acrid scent of wood smoke filled her nose as she crossed the threshold of Red Creek proper, her heartbeat a frantic drum beneath her ribs. Mary paused, brushing snow from her skirt with stiff fingers. She squared her shoulders as best she could. This was it. She had not come all this way to be small. She had come to be seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. And so she took another step forward, unaware that the dream she carried was already crumbling at the edges, delicate as a snowflake landing on a frozen field. When Mary finally arrived at the frontier town of Red Creek, her heart pounding with anticipation, her promised groom, Samuel Carter, greeted her not with open arms, but with cold, contemptuous eyes. "You didn't mention," he hissed, glancing meaningfully at her swollen belly. In front of the townsfolk, he called her a liar and a disgrace, shoving a few coins into her hand as if buying her silence. "Find your own way," he spat before walking off without another word. The townspeople turned their backs. Mary stood alone as the wind howled around her. For a moment, the world slowed to a terrible stillness. The coins clattered from her palm, spilling into the snow, tiny metallic sounds swallowed by the vast, uncaring silence. Her trunk, her only possession left in the world, sagged in the frost at her feet. Mary did not bend to retrieve the money. Some things, even in her ruin, were beneath her. The faces around her blurred, not from tears, but from the sheer cold of their indifference. Women with stiff shawls and wary eyes hurried their children indoors. Men with calloused hands and guns at their hips glanced once, then away, as though the sight of her, a ruined woman, heavy with child and heavier still with shame, was too much of an inconvenience for their conscience. The cold pressed in against her, merciless and sharp. Snow tangled in the loose tendrils of hair escaping from her bonnet. Her cheeks burned from more than the wind. They burned with a heat no winter could numb, the searing animal heat of humiliation. Mary's body ached with exhaustion, but her soul cracked open like thin ice under too much weight. Samuel's words echoed in her head, sharp as splintered glass. Liar. Disgrace. She had given up everything for this, her home, her family, her reputation. She had clutched hope with bleeding hands, believing it would carry her to a better life. Now, standing ankle-deep in the snow of a town that had judged and condemned her in a single glance, she realized hope had abandoned her as swiftly as Samuel had. Still, Mary did not cry. Tears would have been a kindness she could not afford. She wrapped her arms tighter around herself, the weight of the child in her belly anchoring her against the rising tide of despair. If she collapsed now, if she allowed the shame to pull her under, she would vanish. Forgotten, unnamed. The wind tugged at her skirts, biting through the worn wool. Her hands, numb and shaking, closed around the trunk handle once more. No one offered her shelter. No one spoke her name. She was a ghost walking among the living. Unwelcome, unseen, unclaimed. Without looking back, Mary pulled the trunk behind her, each dragging step a refusal to surrender. The coins gleamed like false stars in the snow behind her, and no one stooped to gather them. Above the town, the sky darkened, heavy with another storm, and Mary walked into it, alone. Night fell like a heavy shroud over Red Creek. The weak daylight had bled away into a bruised, iron-colored sky, and now the snow fell harder, sharper, each flake slicing against Mary's skin as she stumbled through the narrow, rutted lanes on the town's edge. The trunk grew heavier with every step, the iron handle biting into her raw, trembling fingers. Her legs, sluggish from hunger and exhaustion, barely lifted through the deepening drifts. She could feel the wetness seeping into her worn boots, numbing her toes, stealing the last of her warmth. Windows glowed faintly from cabins she passed, the soft flicker of hearth fires, the blurred silhouettes of families gathered inside. Laughter rose faintly from one house, a bright alien sound. Mary turned her face away, ashamed of how hungrily she craved the life beyond those walls, not luxury, not riches, but the simple mercy of belonging. But no door opened for her. No hand beckoned. The townsfolk, who had watched her public shaming without protest, now barricaded themselves against the storm, and against her. The child shifted again within her, a slow, desperate roll beneath her heart. Mary stopped, gasping, one hand pressing protectively to her belly. "I'm trying," she whispered into the freezing wind. "I'm trying, baby. Hold on." Her voice disappeared into the blizzard. Beyond the town's last fence post, the prairie stretched out. Vast, cruel, indifferent. A few dead trees stood like blackened sentries against the white. There would be no shelter beyond that point, no miracle waiting in the wilderness, only endless cold. Her knees buckled once, twice, before she forced herself upright, driven by something deeper than pride, deeper even than fear, the primal, aching need to survive, if not for herself, then for the tiny life still depending on her. A battered, abandoned wagon stood half sunk in snow a few yards ahead. It wasn't shelter, not truly, but it was something. Mary staggered toward it, dragging her trunk until it caught on a rock and slipped from her grasp. She left it where it fell. The wagon's wooden frame moaned in the wind as she climbed onto its frozen bed, curling her body around her belly as best she could. The cold was a living thing now, crawling into her bones, whispering in her ears that it would be easier, so much easier, to simply close her eyes. Rest. Let it end. She shook her head violently, fighting the seductive numbness. No, not like this. Not yet. Above her, the sky disappeared completely behind a curtain of snow. Around her, the night pressed closer, thick with silence. Mary lay shivering beneath the broken wagon, invisible to the world that had cast her out, the life inside her flickering as fragile as a candle flame battered by the storm. And still, she endured. Hoofbeats broke the silence. Soft at first, muffled by the storm, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. They grew louder, a steady rhythm pressing against the howling wind, until even Mary, drifting in and out of frozen stupor, heard them. Her mind, sluggish and heavy, tried to make sense of the sound. Had Samuel come back? Had someone finally remembered she existed? Hope flared in her chest, weak, uncertain. But she could not lift her head to look. The weight of the cold had settled over her like a burial shroud. A shadow fell across her. A figure dismounted, boots crunching through the brittle snow. Not a settler, she realized dimly. His silhouette was different, broader in the shoulders, more fluid in movement. Against the backdrop of the storm, his presence seemed almost elemental, like a creature carved from the land itself. Daniel Blackthorne knelt beside the wagon, dark hair dusted with snow, his buckskin coat pulled tight against the bitter air. His sharp eyes swept over Mary's curled form, taking in the thinness of her coat, the shallow rise and fall of her breath, the way one shaking hand clutched protectively at her stomach. He did not ask who she was. He did not ask why no one had come for her. Daniel moved without hesitation, the way a man does when the rightness of an action needs no explanation. He slipped the thick buffalo hide cloak from his shoulders and wrapped it around Mary with a tenderness that no one had shown her in months. The sudden weight of it, heavy, warm, smelling faintly of wood smoke and leather, shocked her senses, dragging her closer to the surface of consciousness. "Easy," he murmured, his voice low, steady, the syllables tinged with the soft cadences of the Cheyenne tongue, his breath misted in the frozen air. Mary tried to speak, but only a rasp escaped her chapped lips. She flinched when his hands slid beneath her, strong, careful, lifting her as if she weighed no more than a bundle of twigs. Pain flared in her hips and back, but she clung to him weakly, driven by instinct. The world tilted sickeningly as he carried her to his horse, a tall, sturdy paint mare who snorted clouds of white into the storm. Daniel shifted her carefully into the saddle before swinging up behind her, cradling her with one arm to keep her steady. The warmth of his body seeped into hers, an anchor against the biting cold. For a moment, just a moment, Mary allowed herself to lean back against him, a stranger, because in a world that had turned its back on her, he was the only solid thing left, the only mercy. Without a word, Daniel turned the horse toward the hills, away from Red Creek, away from judgment and cruelty, and into the endless sweep of white. The snow closed around them, erasing their tracks almost as fast as they were made. But Mary's heart, though battered and faint, stirred with the smallest flicker of something she had thought dead. Not hope yet, but the memory of it. Warmth came slowly, seeping into Mary's bones like water into dry earth. It was not sudden. It was a battle fought inch by inch against the cold that had wrapped itself around her like a shroud. She awoke to the muted crackle of a fire and the gentle murmur of voices speaking in a tongue unfamiliar yet soothing in its rhythm. The sharp bite of wood smoke filled the air, layered with the faint sweetness of herbs. Rough furs cushioned her aching body, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was not cold. For a long time, Mary simply lay still beneath a heavy quilt, too weak and bewildered to move. The steady drumbeat of her child's life pulsed beneath her ribs, reassuring her that not only had she survived, so had he. A hand, light and dry as autumn leaves, brushed against her forehead. Mary flinched instinctively, years of harshness teaching her to fear unfamiliar touch. But the hand only paused, offering her the choice to retreat or accept. Slowly she forced her eyes open. An older woman, face weathered and kind, leaned over her, eyes dark, lined with both sorrow and strength. Her silver-streaked braids framed a face that held no judgment, only deep, patient watching. She murmured something soft, then dipped a cloth into a basin and gently pressed it to Mary's lips. The coolness soothed the cracks there, and Mary drank a few trembling sips before exhaustion pulled her back down into darkness. Later, how much later, she could not tell, Daniel sat near the fire, methodically sharpening a blade by lamplight. He did not look at her directly, but Mary knew he was aware of her every breath. His presence filled the space, steady, quiet, unthreatening. This place, a low-slung lodge built from stretched hides and saplings, was unlike anything she had ever known. It breathed with the rhythm of a different world, slower, older, rooted in the pulse of the land itself. She could hear it in the way the people spoke, in the careful hands that passed her bowls of broth without questions, without conditions. There was no curiosity about her shame, no prying eyes seeking to wound her anew. Here, among strangers who owed her nothing, she found a sanctuary deeper than any she had dared to hope for. Tears burned behind her eyelids, not from fear, not from pain, but from the fragile wonder of being treated as if she were still human. Daniel rose at last and crossed to her side, moving with the easy grace of a man at home in his skin and his silence. He crouched beside her pallet, meeting her gaze without flinching. "You are safe," he said simply, his voice rough but true. 2 words, no promises, no grand declarations, just truth, offered freely, without demand. Mary closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek, and breathed in the strange, unfamiliar air of her new life. For the first time since Red Creek, she let herself believe, just a little, that perhaps the world had not finished with her yet. The days that followed unfolded like the slow turning of winter into spring, imperceptible at first, but certain. Mary's body, battered and starved, healed by small, deliberate degrees. The women of the Cheyenne camp, led by the elder called Little Dove, brought her broths rich with roots and game, gently coaxing life back into her hollow frame. Their hands worked around her, sewing, weaving, grinding corn, always moving, always creating. And in their movements, Mary recognized something deeper than survival. She saw purpose, pride, a quiet defiance against the hardness of the world. At first, she only watched from her place near the fire, wrapped in furs that still carried Daniel's scent of leather and smoke. But Mary had never been one to stay idle for long. Even when her limbs ached and her lungs burned from the lingering chill, she began to reach out, clumsy at first, then with growing steadiness. She learned to mend the torn hems of shirts, her stitches uneven but determined. She crushed herbs with a stone and mixed poultices under Little Dove's patient gaze. She fetched water from the stream, the bucket heavy against her hip, her breath a plume in the morning air. Each small task knitted her back into herself. The village children, curious and unafraid, began to trail after her. They giggled when she taught them little songs in English, their bright voices rising against the white sky. One girl, no older than 6, solemnly pressed a scrap of blue cloth into Mary's hand. A gift. Mary stitched it into the small quilt she had started, a patchwork of memories, her old coat from Red Creek, a piece of the buffalo hide Daniel had wrapped her in, the blue cloth from the laughing child. Every stitch was a declaration. I am still here. I am still worthy. Daniel rarely spoke, but he was never far. He would bring her things, without ceremony, without expectation. A basket of berries, a new pair of moccasins to replace her ruined boots, a length of soft woven cloth. Each offering was left by her fire or placed gently into her hands with a nod. Nothing was demanded in return. And somehow these silent gestures wove something stronger between them than 1,000 words could have. The camp itself became a kind of heartbeat around her, steady and alive. Smoke curled into the sky. Children's laughter rang out among the lodges. The scent of roasting meat and cedar hung in the crisp air. Life, imperfect, persistent, beautiful, pressed on. So did Mary. Not with grand triumphs, not with dramatic declarations, but with every pieced quilt, every stitch, every small act of survival, she planted herself deeper into the soil of this strange new world. And though the ghost of Red Creek still whispered at the edges of her mind, it grew fainter with each sunrise, each simple kindness, each shared smile. Here, under the vast, indifferent sky, Mary Whitaker, fallen, discarded, forgotten, began the slow, sacred work of reclaiming her life. Winter softened its hold on the land. The snow, once a crushing weight against the earth, began to shrink back into pale, brittle patches. Thin tendrils of green threaded through the thawed soil, tentative but stubborn. Life, it seemed, could not be denied, not in the earth, and not in Mary. She rose earlier now, before the first light broke over the eastern hills. Her body, though still worn, moved with a new steadiness. She no longer lingered by the fire, waiting for others to bring her food or comfort. Instead, she sought out tasks, helping Little Dove sort herbs, repairing torn moccasins, sewing tunics with neat, careful stitches. Her hands, which had once trembled with cold and despair, grew sure again. Yet it was in the quiet moments that Mary felt the deepest shift. Daniel lingered at the edges of her days, never intrusive, never demanding, like a steady current beneath the surface. He was a man of few words, but his silences spoke volumes. When she struggled to carry a basket of firewood, it was Daniel who appeared at her side, taking half the load without comment. When her thread tangled hopelessly, it was Daniel who passed her a new length without so much as a sigh. When she sat in the evenings, stitching by firelight, it was Daniel's figure she glimpsed, sitting nearby, whittling a piece of wood into something shapeless and unhurried. They did not speak of the night he had found her, crumpled and half dead beneath the broken wagon. They did not speak of Red Creek or the cruelty that had cast her out. Between them, there was no need to name pain in order to acknowledge it. One evening, as Mary finished sewing the final patches onto her baby's quilt, Daniel approached. He carried something in his hand, small, dark, glinting in the firelight. Without a word, he knelt before her and placed it gently in her lap. It was a carving, smooth and worn from hours of shaping, a tiny bear, its form simple but strong, a symbol, she would later learn, of protection and courage among his people. "For your child," he said, his voice low, almost gruff. Mary's fingers closed around it, the wood warm from the heat of his hands. Her throat tightened painfully. No man had given her anything without strings attached, without expectation, without judgment. "And for me," she whispered, before she could stop herself, shame coloring her cheeks. Daniel met her gaze, steady, unwavering. "For you both," he said. Nothing more, no declarations, no promises. But in that moment, Mary felt the ground shift beneath her feet, not with the violence of betrayal, but with the slow, sure certainty of something real taking root. She cradled the little bear against her chest, feeling the fierce, protective weight of it. And for the first time in a long while, she realized she was not merely surviving. She was beginning to trust again. Not in grand promises, but in small, silent truths that no storm could tear away. The blizzard came without warning, a roaring wall of white that swallowed the sky and smothered the earth beneath its fury. Winds screamed against the sides of the lodges, shaking the hide walls, driving snow in furious drifts across the camp. The fire pits hissed and struggled to breathe against the onslaught, and even the seasoned hunters huddled close to the warmth, waiting for the storm to spend itself. Inside the lodge, Mary curled over herself, pain clenching her body in waves sharp enough to steal the breath from her lungs. Sweat slicked her forehead despite the freezing air. Each contraction tore through her with a mercilessness that left her trembling, raw, but still. She clung to consciousness with every shred of will she possessed. Little Dove worked beside her, calm and unhurried, her hands moving with the steady knowledge of a woman who had midwifed more births than winters she could count. She spoke in low tones, encouraging, grounding, her presence a rock against the storm both inside and out. The other women of the camp moved quietly around them, fetching water warmed by the fire, wringing out cloths, whispering prayers to the spirits. Mary was not alone, though the agony felt like a private crucible she alone could endure. Through the haze of pain, she caught glimpses of Daniel's shadow pacing outside the lodge, his silhouette blurred and distorted by the storm. He did not enter. He knew the old ways, knew that this was a threshold she must cross herself. But his presence was a tether she clung to when the pain threatened to pull her under. Time unraveled. Hours, minutes, seconds, all meaningless now. There was only the relentless climb, the burning, tearing, the desperate need to push, and the terrible fear that she would break apart if she did. And then, with a cry so sharp it seemed to split the very fabric of the storm, her son entered the world. The noise he made was thin at first, a whimper struggling against the cold and the violence of birth. But Little Dove, with deft hands and murmured words, cleared his lungs, and soon his cries filled the lodge with the fierce, unmistakable sound of life. Mary wept, silent, gasping sobs that shook her whole body as they placed the tiny bundle into her arms. Wrapped in the patchwork quilt she had stitched with her own battered hands, he was impossibly small, impossibly perfect. Dark hair, wet and wild, crowned his head, and his face, still scrunched and furious with the effort of living, was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She pressed her lips to his damp forehead, tasting the salt of new life and her own desperate, victorious tears. "Samuel," she whispered, her voice breaking on the name, not for the man who had betrayed her, but for the child. A reclaiming, a rewriting. This Samuel would carry no shame, no judgment, only love. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the lodge, there was a different kind of storm now. The unstoppable force of a mother's love, fierce and vast as the prairie itself. Through the lodge flap, Little Dove caught Daniel's eye and gave a small nod. He sank to his knees in the snow, head bowed, as if offering thanks to something greater than himself. Inside, Mary cradled her son against her breast, her body broken, her spirit burning brighter than it ever had. She had crossed through fire and ice, betrayal and loneliness, and come out the other side holding life itself in her arms. The storm broke by morning. The world outside the lodge was a frozen, glittering silence, a landscape scrubbed clean by the blizzard's fury. Snow hung heavy on the trees, softening the edges of the earth, turning every broken twig and battered path into something pure, untouched. Smoke curled steadily from the lodges, rising into the sharp blue sky like threads stitching the heavens to the land. Inside, Mary lay awake, the newborn tucked safely against her side beneath the warm quilt. She studied his tiny features, the delicate lashes resting against flushed cheeks, the faint, almost imperceptible curve of a smile in his sleep, and felt something deep inside her shift and settle. A promise, wordless but unbreakable, anchored her to this moment, to this life she had fought so hard to claim. The lodge flap rustled, and Daniel entered, stooping slightly to clear the low doorway. He paused just inside, as though unwilling to disturb the fragile sanctity of mother and child. Snow clung to his boots, melting in small, quiet puddles on the packed earth floor. Mary met his gaze, steady, unwavering, and for a moment, the space between them filled with something heavy and sacred. He carried a bundle in his hands, wrapped in soft, tanned hide. Slowly, with the care of a man approaching something infinitely precious, he crossed the room and knelt beside her. "This is for him," he said, unwrapping the bundle to reveal a tiny jacket, sewn from fine elk hide, embroidered with symbols Mary didn't yet know how to read, but felt instinctively were prayers, for strength, for protection, for belonging. Her hands trembled as she touched the garment, the supple leather, the careful stitches. "And for you?" Daniel added after a long, weighted pause, his voice low, rough-edged with something more vulnerable than any blizzard could strip away. She looked up at him, heart pounding with a fierce, aching tenderness she barely understood. Daniel reached into the folds of his coat and drew out a simple necklace, a leather thong strung with carved beads and a small stone, worn smooth by years of handling. "In my people's way," he said, "it is given when one asks another to walk beside them, not just for a season, for all seasons." His words, though spare, hit harder than any grand declaration could have. Tears filled Mary's eyes, blurring the firelight into golden halos. For so long she had been drifting, unwanted, unseen. Now, without demands, without conditions, a place was being offered. Not just for her son, but for her. A home, a family, a future not built on shame, but on shared strength. She pressed the little jacket against her heart, feeling its warmth seep into her, and then, with slow, deliberate care, she reached out and closed her hand around Daniel's offered necklace. "I would be honored," she whispered. Daniel smiled, not broadly, but with a depth that needed no embellishment. He bowed his head, accepting her answer in the same quiet way he had offered his hand, without pride, without conquest. Only with the simple, enduring strength of a man who knew the worth of a promise kept. The baby stirred against her side, murmuring softly in his sleep. Mary cradled him closer, the quilt, the jacket, the necklace, all symbols of a life reclaimed, a life remade, wrapping around them like the first warm breath of spring after a brutal winter. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft, light, gentle this time. Not a storm, not a threat, just a blessing, covering the broken tracks of the past. Spring came slowly to the plains, unfolding in cautious, tender gestures. The last crusts of snow receded from the hillsides. Thin blades of grass pierced the softened earth. The river, once shackled in ice, murmured freely again, weaving its silver path across the valley like a ribbon of hope. Mary stood at the edge of the Cheyenne camp, the baby cradled against her chest in the quilt she had stitched through winter's hardest days. The jacket Daniel had gifted him fit snugly now, the tiny embroidered symbols shining faintly in the morning light. Around her, life stirred with quiet purpose. Women setting out baskets to dry in the sun, children chasing each other in circles of giddy laughter, men preparing their horses for the spring hunt. It was a rhythm Mary had come to know intimately, a heartbeat that welcomed her into its steady, ancient cadence. She was not an outsider anymore, not a charity case, not a fallen woman. Here she was simply Mary, mother, wife, a thread woven firmly into the tapestry of a people who had given her a place not because they had to, but because they saw her worth. Daniel approached, leading his horse with one hand. He wore his everyday leathers, simple, unadorned, but to Mary he carried the presence of something larger than the sum of his clothing or tools. A man built from patience and quiet strength, who asked nothing except that she be fully, fiercely herself. He reached for her hand without a word, and she gave it freely, the old scars on her heart growing softer under his touch. They rode together that morning, their son bundled securely against Mary's chest, his tiny fists waving in delight at the sway of the horse. The land stretched endlessly before them, golden where the grass had already turned, deep green where the new shoots fought for life. It was not the life Mary had once imagined, sitting in her father's parlor, dreaming of small-town respectability. It was something wilder, deeper, infinitely more real. As they crested a ridge, she looked back once, toward the distant memory of Red Creek, a cluster of shapes now barely distinguishable from the earth itself. The place that had cast her out had no claim on her anymore. Its cruelty was a shadow left behind in the snowmelt. Ahead, the prairie opened wide, a canvas untouched, waiting to be filled. Mary tightened her arms around her child, leaned into Daniel's side, and breathed in the clean, wild air. She had not been saved by pity. She had not been redeemed by charity. She had been seen, accepted, loved. And under the endless, forgiving sky, Mary Whitaker, abandoned, scorned, forgotten, was reborn. Not as the woman Red Creek had tried to bury, but as the woman she had always been beneath the sorrow, strong, tender, unbreakable. And this time the world would not silence her, not ever again.